Hello, my name is David, and this is part of the project to read aloud the report from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This evening I'll be starting partway through page 236. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people in British Columbia, Canada. The Commission's 2012 interim report made 3 recommendations directed at provincial and territorial governments. Recommendation 4. The Commission recommends that each provincial and territorial government undertake a review of the curriculum materials currently in use in public schools to assess what, if anything, they teach about residential schools. Recommendation 5. The Commission recommends that provincial and territorial departments of education work in concert with the Commission to develop age-appropriate educational materials about residential schools for use in public schools. Recommendation 6. The Commission recommends that each provincial and territorial government work with the Commission to develop public education campaigns to inform the general public about the history and impact of residential schools in their respective jurisdictions. At various times, the Commission met with provincial and territorial education ministers from across Canada. In July 2014, the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, CMEC, gave us an update on the status of curriculum development commitments across the country. The Commission was encouraged to see that progress has been made. We note, however, that not all provinces and territories have yet made curriculum about residential schools mandatory, and not all courses cover the subject in depth. The Northwestern Territories and Nunavut have taken a leadership role in developing and implementing mandatory curriculum about residential schools for all high school students, in engaging survivors directly in the development of new materials, and in ensuring that teachers receive appropriate training and support, including direct access with survivors. At the time of this writing, Yukon has begun the process of adapting the Northwest Territories and Nunavut materials for mandatory use in its territory. Among the provinces, Alberta publicly declared that it was launching its own initiative to develop mandatory curriculum on the treaties and residential schools for all students. These educational initiatives are significant, but it will be essential to ensure that the momentum is not lost in the years following the end of the Commission's mandate. To be successful over the long term, this and similar initiatives will require substantive and sustained support from provincial and territorial governments, educators, and local school districts. An ongoing commitment from ministers of education throughout the country is critical. The Commission notes that on July 9, 2014, the CMEC announced that education ministers, quote, agreed to additional pan-Canadian work in Aboriginal education to take place over the next 2 years, which will focus on 4 key directional ideas: support for Aboriginal students' interest in pursuing teaching as a career, development of learning resources on Canadian history and the legacy of Indian residential schools that could be used by teacher training programs, sharing of promising practices in Aboriginal education, and ongoing promotion of learning about Indian residential schools in K-12 education systems. In regions where curriculum and teacher training on residential schools has been introduced, it will be necessary to build upon these early successes and evaluate progress on an ongoing basis. Where education about residential schools is minimal, provincial and territorial governments can benefit from lessons learned in jurisdictions that have made this material a mandatory requirement. The Commission notes that throughout the residential school era, Catholic and Protestant religious schools taught students only about their own religions. Students were ill-prepared to understand or respect other religions or spiritual perspectives, including those of Aboriginal peoples. In our view, no religious school receiving public funding should be allowed to teach one religion to the complete exclusion of all other religions. This is consistent with the Supreme Court of Canada decision in SL versus Commissioner Scholar de Chines in 2012. At issue was whether Quebec's mandatory ethics and religious cultures program, which was introduced in 2008 to replace Catholic and Protestant programs of religious and moral instruction with a comparative religion course taught from a neutral and objective perspective, violated charter rights of Catholic parents and children to be taught only Catholic religious beliefs. However, the court ruled, Exposing children to a comprehensive presentation of various religions without forcing the children to join them does not constitute an indoctrination of students that would infringe on the freedom of religion. Furthermore, the early exposure of children to realities that differ from those in their immediate family environment is a fact of life and society. The suggestion that exposing children to a variety of religious facts in itself infringes on religious freedom, or that their parents amount to a rejection of the multicultural reality of Canadian society and ignores Quebec's obligation with regard to public education. The Commission believes that religious diversity courses must be mandatory in all provinces and territories. Any religious school receiving public funding must be required to teach at least one course on comparative religious studies, which must include a segment on Aboriginal spiritual beliefs and practices. Calls to action. 62. We call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments, in consultation and collaboration with survivors, Aboriginal peoples, and educators, to 1. Make age-appropriate curriculum on residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal peoples' historical and contemporary contributions to Canada, a mandatory educational requirement for kindergarten to grade 12 students. 2. Provide the necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms. 3. Provide the necessary funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms. And 4. Establish senior-level positions in government at the Assistant Deputy Minister level or higher dedicated to Aboriginal content and education. 63. We call upon the Council of Ministers of Education, Canada, to maintain an annual commitment to Aboriginal education issues, including 1. Developing and implementing kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum and learning resources on Aboriginal peoples in Canadian history and the history and legacy of residential schools. 2. Sharing information and best practices on teaching curriculum related to residential schools and Aboriginal history. 3. Building student capacity for intercultural understanding, empathy, and mutual respect. And 4. Identifying teacher training needs related to the above. 64. We call upon all levels of government that provide public funds to denominational schools to require such schools to provide an education on comparative religious studies, which must include a segment on Aboriginal spiritual beliefs and practices developed in collaboration with Aboriginal elders. Thank you.